Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is the verbatim federal courtroom testimony of the Sean Diddy Combs trial as reported by Inner City Press. What shocking revelation did Z just deliver that left the entire courtroom in stunned silence? Why are legal experts calling his testimony the most damaging from an industry insider thus far? And what did JC mean when he looked directly at Diddy and said those 7 words that may have just sealed the case? I'm done covering for you, Sean. If you want to understand the bombshell moment that has permanently altered the course of this historic trial, make sure to watch this entire video, like and subscribe now to stay updated on all the latest developments in this unprecedented case in a federal courtroom where Sean Diddy Combs faces serious charges. Music mogul Sean J.C. Carter took the stand not as a longtime industry colleague, but as a reluctant yet resolute witness whose testimony carry the weight of decades at the highest levels of the music business. His very presence transformed the atmosphere, but it was his words delivered with characteristic precision and unmistakable authority that truly stunned everyone present. As Carter methodically recounted his history with Combs and specific incidents he had witnessed or been made aware of, his demeanor visibly deteriorated. The typically confident defendant seemed to shrink with each detailed account, his legal team increasingly desperate to object as Z's testimony systematically dismantled key element of their defense strategy. Why would JC, one of music's most powerful figures and someone who has carefully maintained business relationships throughout his legendary career, take such a definitive stand against a longtime industry peer? What specific knowledge pushed him to break the music industry's unwritten code of silence? And what final statement did he make that caused Diddy to put his head in his hands, apparently recognizing the case might be lost? This isn't just another witness testimony. It's a pivotal moment where one of hip-hop's most strategic and measured voices decided that truth must prevail over industry allegiances. The full account, unflinching and consequential, begins now. I'm standing in front of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse where moments ago hip-hop more Gold JC exited after delivering what legal observers are calling game-changing testimony in the ongoing trial of Sean Diddy Combs. Carter moved through the crowd with characteristic composure, declining to make additional statements. As he was escorted to a waiting vehicle inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had been transformed by Carter's presence. Dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit with subtle pinstripes, JC carried himself with the same measured confidence that has defined his public persona, but with an added gravity appropriate to the proceedings. He spoke clearly and deliberately, making eye contact with the jury during key point of his testimony. Nobody expected JC to appear today. The room was tense with anticipation as the prosecution had announced only that an industry associate with relevant information would testify. Eyes focused on the witness stand until the bailiff announced the United States. Call Sean Carter. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Even the judge seemed momentarily taken aback. There had been no media speculation, no leaked information suggesting his appearance. There he stood, Jay's one of music's most successful entrepreneurs and artists, ready to testify in a case against someone who had long been considered his peer in the industry. Until that moment, Diddy had maintained remarkable composure throughout the proceedings, occasionally conferring with his legal team or making notes, but something visibly shifted when Carter and maybe it was seeing someone of equal or greater stature in the industry now appearing for the prosecution. Maybe it was knowing what specific incidents and conversations JC might reveal. Maybe it was realizing that his carefully constructed defense was about to face testimony from someone whose credibility would be difficult to undermine. Whatever it was, did his confident demeanor instantly tense? JC wasn't there as a rival or competitor. He was there as someone who had navigated the same industry terrain for decades, who had observed its practices from multiple perspectives, as an artist label executive and business owner, and who had apparently reached a moral tipping point, and when he began his testimony delivered with his characteristic precision and strategic clarity, the courtroom wasn't prepared for how methodically he would dismantle Diddy's defense, because what Jeezy revealed about specific incidents he had witnessed, conversations that had taken place, and patterns of behavior he had observed wasn't just shocking, it was a comprehensive account from someone who understood the music industry's power dynamics intimately and could explain them with unparalleled credibility. It started like any other day of the trial. The room buzzed with low conversations, the press hunched in their designated rows, and lawyers organized documents as they prepared for the day's proceedings. But when the bailiff announced the United States called Sean Carter to the stand, the room changed. Age instantly could hear a pin drop. Some people exchanged startled glances, others craned their necks toward the entrance. The prosecution team maintained composed expressions, suggesting they had successfully kept this high-impact witness confidential. The judge raised an eyebrow, and Diddy, who had been reviewed and documents with his attorneys, suddenly looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to visible concern. Carter walked to the witness stand with measured steps, his presence commanding attention without the theatrics he didn't acknowledge. He didn't play to the gallery, simply focused on the oath and his responsibility to the court. I'm here today because there comes a point where silence becomes complicity. Carter began. After being sworn in, this industry has codes and unwritten rules about loyalty, but there are lines that shouldn't be crossed, and I've witnessed those lines being crossed. The judge allowed him to continue, and from that moment on, the entire trial shifted, because what Carter was about to say wasn't speculation or rumor, it was first-hand knowledge from someone who had been at the center of the music industry for decades. Carter explained that his history with Diddy dated back to the mid-1990s, when both were ascending figures and hip-hop, Diddy through Bad Boy Records and JC through OC. Their professional paths intersected continuously throughout their careers, from music collaboration to business ventures and industry events. The music industry at that level is a small world, Carter testified. We've been in the same rooms, at the same tables, making the same deals for over 25 years. There's very little that happens at that level that isn't observed or discussed. The relationship was professional, sometimes friendly, occasionally competitive. They operated in the same spaces, navigated the same terrain, and understood the same industry dynamics. That context, Carter explained, was essential to understanding the significance of what he had witnessed over the years. There was a period in the early 2000 when I became increasingly concerned about patterns I was observing. He continued, not just business practices, but personal behavior that crossed lines. I initially attributed some of it to the excesses that sometimes come with success in this industry, but over time it became clear that what I was seeing went beyond that. The judge leaned forward, clearly engaged by the testimony. Diddy's attorney attempted to object on grounds of relevance, but was overruled when the prosecution explained that this established the context for specific incidents. Carter would describe there were industry events, private gatherings, after parties, where I observed Sean's behavior changing when and substances were involved. Carter continued, particularly concerning was how he interacted with women in his professional but artists, assistants, associates. I've built my career on calculated decisions, Carter said, his voice maintaining its characteristic control. I've created companies, broken artists, made investments, but the most important calculations involve knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Today, speaking is the only calculation that makes sense. He turned slightly to where did he sat, because what I've witnessed from Sean over the years has gone well beyond industry norms or acceptable behavior. Carter told the courtroom that it started like many concerning patterns, with incidents that could initially be dismissed or explained away. It came through observations at industry events, the way power, our dynamics played out between Diddy and those dependent on him professionally. He expected some degree of the usual industry politics and positioning, but this felt different, more controlling, more potentially harmful. But the moment he realized something truly concerning was happening was during a private industry event around 2009. On the second he observed Diddy's interaction with a female artist on his label, he noticed the fear and her body language. That should have been the first red flag. She was outwardly smiling but physically tense, positioned like someone preparing to deflect unwanted contact. It felt like something beyond professional pressure, something more personal and potentially dangerous. Carter described how he later attempted to speak with Diddy about what he had observed. I approached it as one businessman to another, suggesting that there were lines between professional authority and personal conduct that needed to be respected. Sean dismissed my concerns, saying I didn't understand how he handled his business. As Carter recounted this conversation, Diddy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His attorney placed a warning hand on his arm. That conversation, I began paying closer attention. I noticed patterns: artists who seemed afraid rather than respectful, physical injuries explained away as accidents, people suddenly leaving his employment without explanation. These weren't isolated incidents, they formed a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Carter described specific events where he had either witnessed concerning behavior directly or had been informed about incidents immediately after they occurred by credible sources who were present. There was an industry after party following the BET Awards around 2012. I arrived late, ate, and immediately one of my team members pulled me aside. They told me Cassie Ventura had been seen being forcefully grabbed and pulled into a side room by Sean earlier in the evening. When she emerged later, she was visibly distressed, but attempting to act normal. My team member was concerned because it appeared to be physical intimidation, not just a heated conversation. Carter said he began to recognize a system at work, thinking they would have a standard industry conversation about professionalism. Instead, what he observed was a pattern of power being wielded in increasingly concerning ways. They were indicators that went beyond typical industry manipulation, financial dependency, and isolation of artists from support systems. And throughout these situations, Diddy's approach was systematic and consistent. Carter paused, his expression grave. I've been in this business long enough to distinguish between tough negotiation tactics and something more sinister. What I was observing crossed that line repeatedly. Carter continued, his voice steady but resolute. In 2014, I attended an industry function where I encountered one of Sean's former assistants who had recently left his employment. When I asked casually about her departure, she became visibly uncomfortable. Later that evening, when Sean wasn't present, she confided that she had left after witnessing him physically assault Cassie in a private setting. She was afraid of professional retaliation if she reported it. He described how he attempted to address these concerns again with Diddy. I approached Sean at the ROC Nation brunch in 2015. I suggested there were rumors circulating that could damage him professionally and personally if they continued. His response was telling. He didn't ask what rumors, he didn't express concern about potential misunderstandings. He simply said, I handle my business my way. Stay in your lane. Carter testified that while these interactions troubled him, the music industry's culture of silence made intervention difficult. There's an unwritten code in this business about not interfering in another person's empire. I regret now that I allowed that code to override what I was seeing. The court was really silent now. Jurors leaned forward. The judge had stopped taking notes and was simply watching Carter intently. Diddy had gone from occasionally whispering to his attorneys to sitting completely still, his expression increasingly strained. What troubled me most was the system around Sean that enabled this behavior. Carter continued. There were people whose job appeared to be handling the aftermath of these incidents, arranging private medical care, negotiating silence, managing public appearances to hide evidence of physical confrontations. It wasn't just Sean acting alone, it was an infrastructure designed to conceal and continue a pattern of behavior. The prosecution then produced communications obtained during the investigation that corroborated aspects of Carter's account, including text messages referencing another situation that needs handling and making sure no one talks about what happened last night. Carter's voice took on new gravity as he described what ultimately brought him to testify. Chained a professional relationship with Sean for years, trying to navigate the complex reality of our industry connections while becoming increasingly troubled by what I was witnessing. Then I saw the hotel surveillance video that was released during this case. That video confirmed what I had been hearing and observing for years. It wasn't an isolated incident or exaggerated account, it was documented evidence of exactly the pattern I had seen glimpses of repeatedly. I could no longer rationalize or compartmentalize what I knew. Carter explained that for years he had attempted to address concerns privately, believing that was the appropriate approach, given their industry standard. In every time I saw another incident or heard another account, I thought about the broader implications, not just for the individuals involved, but for an industry that too often protects power at the expense of people. He looked around the courtroom. The music industry has evolved in many ways, but its handling of abuse of power has lagged behind. Too often careers and connections take precedence over conduct and character. Carter paused, glanced at the jury, and leaned closer to the microphone. When I saw that video followed by Cassie Ventura as courageous testimony, I knew that my silence was no longer an option. The pattern I had observed over years was now visible to everyone, and denying what I knew would make me complicit. It was at this point that the most dramatic moment of the testimony occurred. The prosecutor asked, "Mr. Carter, did you speak with the defendant after the surveillance video became public?" Carter nodded. "I did. I called Sean directly. I told him that the video confirmed what I had been hearing for years. I told him that his behavior had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. I told him that the industry's code of silence wouldn't protect him anymore, nor should it." The prosecutor asked what was Mr. Combs' response. Carter's reply was measured but devastating. He said, "You know how this industry works. This will blow over if everyone stays in their lane." He wasn't denying what happened. He was counting on the same system of silence in protection that had insulated him for years. At this point, Carter looked directly at Diddy for the first time since taking the stand. "That's when I told them, I'm done covering for you, Sean. The truth needs to come out." As Carter spoke these words, Diddy's composure finally broke completely. He put his head in his hands, his attorneys whispering urgently beside him. Several jurors visibly reacted, with one writing something down. Immediately, the prosecutor continued, "Based on your decades of experience in the music industry and your personal observations, what is your assessment of the defendant's conduct as you've described it today?" Carter's response was thoughtful and impactful. "What I've observed goes beyond the typical power dynamics of this industry. I've seen executives make tough business decisions. I've seen artists face professional consequences. What I witnessed with Sean was different. It was a pattern of using professional power to enable personal abuse, particularly toward women in vulnerable positions. That's not business, that's not industry standard, that's wrong by any measure." Carter concluded his testimony. The judge called for a recess. The energy in the courtroom had transformed completely. Diddy, who had maintained a composed facade for most of the trial, now sat conferring intensely with his legal team, his expression reflecting the severity of the testimony against him. When court resumed, his lead attorney launched into cross-exit, attempting to portray Carter as a business rival with competitive motivations for testifying against Combs. "Mr. Carter, isn't it true that you and Mr. Combs have been competitors in various business ventures over the years?" the attorney asked. We've been both competitors and collaborators. Carter responded calmly. We've appeared on tracks together, attended the same events, invested in some of the same spaces. That's precisely why I have the perspective I've shared today. I've been close enough to observe while maintaining my own independent position in the industry. Yet you never reported any of these alleged observations to authorities at the time. The attorney pressed. Like many in this industry, I operated under certain assumptions about handling matters internally, about respecting boundaries between different power structures. I recognize now that was a mistake. When the evidence became undeniable and public, I could no longer justify that approach. My presence here today is an attempt to correct that error in judgment. Each attempt to undermine Carter's credibility seemed to backfire, as his responses remained measured, thoughtful, and authentic. The jury appeared to be assessing him not as a celebrity, but as a credible witness whose testimony aligned with other evidence they had heard. When Carter was finally excused from the witness stand, he walked from the courtroom with the same composed dignity with which he had entered. He didn't look back at Diddy. He didn't play to the gallery, simply exited with purpose. Outside the courtroom, the music industry was already experiencing seismic aftershocks. Social media exploded with reactions, with many industry figures posting messages about a new era of accountability. Major labels began issuing statements about reviewing internal policies and strengthening reporting mechanisms for misconduct behind closed doors. Crisis meetings were being called at entertainment companies throughout New York, and Los Angeles legal department began auditing historical complaints and current price. Actor says public relations teams crafted statements emphasizing zero-tolerance policies, but the conversation had fundamentally shifted from abstract principles to specific accountability. As the day's proceedings ended and attendees filed out of the courthouse, legal analysts were already describing Carter's testimony as potentially decisive, not just for this